Everyone, by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to compare and contrast the two types of transport, passive and active transport mechanisms, and you should be able to explain the importance of passive and active transport in maintaining homeostasis for a cell. So we kind of already talked about different organelles that are found in the cell, and we focused on the cell membrane, and we said that the cell membrane is a selectively permeable organelle which moves or selects different types of materials into and out of the cell. Today, we're going to be looking at different methods of transporting materials in and out of the cell membrane. And specifically, we're going to be looking at passive and active transport mechanisms. So, how does the cell membrane move things in and out of the cell? There are two main ways that the cell membrane does this. The first is through passive transport. And just from the name, we can kind of assume that passive transport happens on its own passively without the need for any external help. Specifically, it does not require any energy. So materials are moved in and out of the cell membrane during passive transport without the need for any energy to be used. There are two different types of passive transport mechanisms. The first is diffusion, and a specialized type of diffusion is facilitated diffusion. The second type of passive transport is osmosis. On the other hand, we have active transport, which actually requires energy. And we kind of get this idea because of the word active in the name. So active transport needs energy to happen. There are three examples of active transport mechanisms that we're going to be discussing. Active transport using protein pumps, endocytosis, and exocytosis. So let's start with passive transport. Passive transport is defined as the movement of materials without the use of energy, and these materials are generally being moved with a concentration gradient. So a concentration gradient is basically how particles are moving inside the cell. And usually the concentration gradient, or particles in general, will move with the concentration gradient. In other words, they move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So this is what the H to L here represents: high concentration of particles to low concentration of particles. So generally, particles are always moving with the gradient from an area where they are very concentrated, highly concentrated, to an area where there is less concentration of particles. An example of, or one type of passive transport mechanism, like we said, is diffusion, which is defined as the movement of molecules in fluid or gas from an area of high concentration to low concentration without energy. A specialized type of diffusion is facilitated diffusion, which does the exact same thing, but it uses transport proteins. Now, if you remember from our talk about the cell membrane, we said that the cell membrane is generally nonpolar. Therefore, particles that are small or nonpolar will be able to diffuse in and out of the cell membrane without the need of any help or any external molecules to kind of bring them in and out. So in this case, if a molecule is very small, or if it is nonpolar, it will be able to diffuse in and out of the cell membrane without the need for any external help. On the other hand, if a molecule is large or polar, it will use facilitated diffusion. Okay, so it will need to use these specialized transport proteins or protein channels to help the particle move in and out of the cell with the concentration gradient. Again, we are not using any energy. Now, if this particle is a water particle, then it will move via a different mechanism known as osmosis. So osmosis is the movement of water molecules from an area of high to low concentration. So notice that in both diffusion and osmosis, these particles are being moved with the concentration gradient from an area of high to low concentration without the need of any energy involved. The only difference is that with diffusion, we are moving gas or dissolved particles, okay? And in osmosis, we are moving water particles specifically. The second form of transport mechanism is active transport. And active transport is the movement of materials with the use of energy. And the reason why the cell is using energy is because it is moving against the concentration gradient from an area of low to high concentration. So I want you to think about a day where you might have went swimming in a river or in a pool and there was a current of water flowing in one direction. If you were to swim with this current, okay, in the same direction of the current, you will notice that swimming is super easy. You don't really have to exert any energy because essentially that current is moving you along with it. On the other hand, if you were to swim against the current, if you were to swim against the water flow or the direction of the water flow, it's a lot more difficult to swim, right? You need to exert a lot more energy to move from point A to point B if you are moving against the current. Well, the same thing happens with these materials. If the materials or if the molecules are being transported in and out of the cell against the concentration gradient or against the current from an area of low to high concentration, then the cell, of course, needs to use energy because it's kind of going against the flow, right? Against the flow of materials. So there are different methods or mechanisms of active transport. The first is a protein pump or using protein pumps. So protein pumps basically require energy to move things in and out of the cell. Specifically, protein pumps will be involved in moving ions, which you remember as being charged atoms. So if the cell is bringing in or out these ions, again, against the gradient, against the current, using energy, it will use protein pumps. So something like potassium, sodium, all of these really important ions, which are essential for keeping our cells alive, will be moved in and out using protein pumps. If the cell is taking in liquids or solids, really large, bulky liquids or solids, by engulfing them into the cell membrane or into the cell, then it will use endocytosis. So again, endocytosis is a form of active transport, which means that these materials, whether liquid or solid, are being moved against the gradient using energy. And basically, endocytosis happens when the cell is engulfing, essentially eating really large liquids or solids and bringing them into the cell membrane. If the cell is taking in solids, this is known as phagocytosis. And if the cell is taking in liquids, this is known as pinocytosis. In general, endocytosis, whether phago or pinocytosis, so these are basically two examples of endocytosis. In general, endocytosis is a active transport mechanism, which means that these particles, the liquids and the solids, are being moved against the gradient. Okay, so the last example or form of active transport is exocytosis. So just from the name, exo reminds us of the word exit, right? So exocytosis is just the opposite of endocytosis. Here, the cell is releasing large amounts of liquids or solids out of the cell against the gradient using the cell membrane. So basically, exocytosis is still a form of active transport because the cell is moving things against the gradient. And specifically, it is moving things out of the cell. And these things will usually be either large solids or large liquid materials. All right, and this concludes our topic for today.